The town of Market Ledbury lay tucked amid the rolling hills of Sussex, where ivy-clad cottages lined the streets and the air held a perennial scent of honeysuckle. At its heart stood Ravenswood Manor, a grand but aging estate belonging to the illustrious Devereux family, whose wealth was matched only by their taste for seclusion. It was on an unremarkable Thursday morning that the stillness of Ravenswood was shattered. Miss Evelyn Devereux, the sharp-eyed and steel-nerved matriarch, had discovered the body of her husband's former tutor and lifelong librarian, Mr. Reginald Bellamy, sprawled in the expansive library. The great mahogany desk was meticulously organized except for the single crimson stain marring its polished surface. Bellamy lay slumped in the high-backed leather chair, his eyes open but unseeing, a letter opener embedded in his chest. The household erupted in panic. Mrs. Devereux had summoned the police at once, and they arrived promptly, bustling about the crime scene with grave faces. Chief Inspector Harold Strickland, a burly man with a practical mind, took the lead, his notebook ever at the ready. Mrs. Devereux, visibly shaken yet resolute, recounted how she had entered the library to consult Bellamy about a missing ledger, only to stumble upon the ghastly scene. The doors and windows were locked from the inside, and none of the servants had reported seeing anyone enter or leave. The household staff, cook, housemaid, and groundskeeper, were questioned briefly, but none had any useful information. All the while, the family members gathered in the drawing-room, exchanging fearful glances. There was Lawrence Devereux, the heir to the estate. A tall, brooding young man recently returned from Oxford, still nursing resentment over his father's decision to reduce his allowance. Beside him sat his younger sister, Abigail, whose pale face and quiet demeanor seemed at odds with her restless hands. Across the room, Sir Hugo Devereux, the aging patriarch, sat in his armchair, his hands trembling as he lit his pipe. Lastly, there was Frances Devereux, the widow of Sir Hugo's late brother, her presence as sharp and cold as a winter morning. Chief Inspector Strickland eyed them all, making notes as he went. He had just begun to contemplate his next move when a sleek black car pulled up the gravel drive. Out stepped a short, impeccably dressed man with a waxed mustache that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. Strickland let out a groan of both relief and apprehension. "Hercule Poirot," he muttered under his breath. Poirot entered the drawing-room with his signature precision, his eyes sweeping over the assembled company. He acknowledged Strickland with a polite nod. "I heard of the unfortunate occurrence at Ravenswood," Poirot announced, his accent lending a curious rhythm to his speech. "I happened to be in the vicinity, and I thought I might be of assistance." Sir Hugo looked up, his eyes moist with grief. "You are most welcome, Monsieur Poirot." "Poor Bellamy! Who would have done such a thing?" Poirot did not immediately respond, his gaze lingering on the polished brass doorknob of the library door. "Mon cher inspecteur," he finally said, "if you would allow me a moment to examine the scene." Strickland, torn between gratitude and frustration, led Poirot to the library. Inside, Poirot's keen eyes danced across the room. He noted the orderly rows of books, the gleaming desk, and the solitary book that lay open on the floor, a volume on local folklore. Poirot bent to examine the letter opener embedded in Bellamy's chest. He did not touch it, but made a soft sound of contemplation. A curious choice of weapon, is it not? Something one might find at hand during a sudden argument, perhaps. Strickland huffed. Likely a crime of passion, someone who didn't plan it. Poirot's mustache twitched with faint disapproval. "Ah, but passion leaves its own fingerprints, n'est-ce pas? This, I think, is a passion most carefully catalogued." As Poirot turned back to the drawing-room, he cast one last glance at the overturned book. "Inspector," he murmured, "have the fingerprints on the letter opener been examined?" Strickland frowned. "Not yet. We were just about to start." Poirot nodded, his mind already piecing together the first fragment of the puzzle. "Bon, We must speak to each of the household members. I should like to hear how they spent their morning." Poirot straightened, smoothing an invisible crease in his perfectly tailored jacket as he returned to the drawing room. The assembled family members and staff looked up, their expressions a mélange of fear, suspicion, and barely concealed annoyance. It was clear that the arrival of the famous detective had cast a new shadow over the household, a shadow of scrutiny they could not escape. Poirot's sharp eyes swept over the room, noting each reaction. Lawrence Devereux's jaw tightened, a faint pulse flickering at his temple. Abigail clasped her hands in her lap, fingers intertwined so tightly they had turned white. Frances Devereux maintained her frosty composure, her gaze fixed somewhere above Poirot's head, as if even acknowledging his presence was beneath her. Sir Hugo, by contrast, seemed deflated, his head bowed as if the weight of the family's disgrace rested solely on his narrow shoulders. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice both gentle and firm. "I understand this is a most trying time, but I must insist on speaking with each of you in turn. We shall begin, perhaps, with those who last saw Mr. Bellamy alive." Lawrence leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Do you really think any of us, his family, could have done this? Bellamy was like a second father to us, a mentor." Poirot's eyes sparkled with a flicker of something that might have been amusement. "You misunderstand me, monsieur. I'm not suggesting that anyone here is guilty. I merely seek to understand the chain of events leading to this most unfortunate incident." He clasped his hands together in a gesture of almost reverent contemplation. "It is in the small details, you see, that the truth often lies." Lawrence hesitated, then leaned back, his storm-gray eyes narrowing. Abigail cast a furtive glance at her brother before looking away, her lips pressed tightly together. Poirot's gaze shifted to Sir Hugo. "If I might begin with you, Sir Hugo?" The old man looked up, his fingers trembling slightly as he set his pipe aside. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. What would you like to know?" Poirot moved closer, his patent leather shoes whispering against the polished parquet floor. "When did you last see Mr. Bellamy?" Sir Hugo exhaled slowly, his hand moving to his heart as if steadying himself. "Last night, after supper. We shared a brandy in the library, as was our custom. Bellamy had a passion for obscure literature, you see. He often regaled me with some forgotten piece of prose he had unearthed from the library's dusty shelves." Poirot nodded, filing the detail away. "And did he seem troubled, perhaps? Unusual in his manner." Sir Hugo's brow furrowed in thought. "No, not particularly. He was his usual steady self. If anything, he seemed rather pleased with himself. Said he had found something of great interest that he intended to show me this morning. I had not the faintest idea what he meant, but then Bellamy always had his little secrets." His voice faltered. "And now?" Poirot's gaze flicked to the library door, still ajar, the faint metallic tang of blood wafting through. "Curious," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone present. "And you, mademoiselle?" He turned to Abigail, whose eyes widened slightly. "When did you last see Mr. Bellamy?" Abigail's lips parted, and she glanced quickly at Lawrence, who gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. Poirot caught the gesture, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. I saw him this morning," she stammered, her voice as fragile as porcelain. "I went to the library to return a book. Bellamy was already at his desk, writing something. He barely looked up when I entered. I returned the book and left. I did not speak to him." Poirot's head tilted slightly, his eyes keen. "And this book you returned, what was it?" Abigail's cheeks flushed and she hesitated. "It was a collection of poems, a personal favorite. I often borrowed books from the library. Bellamy never minded." Poirot's sharp mind seized upon the slight quiver in her voice, the way her fingers twisted the lace of her sleeve. A nervous habit, perhaps, or something more. "And you, Monsieur Lawrence?" Poirot turned his attention to the elder sibling. "Did you also visit the library this morning?" Lawrence's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "No, I did not. I had no reason to speak with Bellamy. Today, my studies keep me occupied, and frankly, I find little interest in my uncle's dusty tomes." Poirot's expression did not change, but his eyes flicked toward the slender, leather-bound volume still lying on the library floor, its pages splayed like the wings of a crushed bird. "Interesting," he murmured. "And yet the library is often the heart of a house like this, n'est-ce pas? A place where secrets are both kept and revealed." Francis Devereux, who had been watching the exchange with icy detachment, finally stirred. "If you intend to question us all, Monsieur Poirot, I would appreciate it if you were swift. Some of us have matters to attend to." Poirot inclined his head, his mustache twitching with faint amusement. "Indeed, madam, I shall not keep you long." He took a step back, his sharp gaze moving from face to face. "But I would ask one final question of you all. Had any of you reason to believe that Mr. Bellamy feared for his life?" The question hung in the air, drawing a collective intake of breath. Francis's eyes flicked to Sir Hugo, whose hands trembled once more. Lawrence looked away, his expression unreadable, while Abigail's head dipped, a strand of dark hair falling across her cheek. Poirot waited, the silence stretching, pulling at the corners of the room like a tightening noose. And then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, he straightened, his expression resolute. "Very well," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I shall take my leave for now, but rest assured, mes amis, the truth will reveal itself, for it cannot remain hidden forever. The mind that sees all, that understands all, will uncover even the darkest of secrets." With a final, sweeping glance at the assembled company, Poirot turned and made his way to the library once more, his little grey cells already dancing with the first whispers of deduction. Poirot stepped back into the dimly lit library, his polished shoes whispering against the thick Persian rug. The faint odor of aged leather and dried ink clung to the air, mingling with the sharper metallic scent of blood. The room, once a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, now bore the grim stain of violence. He approached the desk, where Bellamy's lifeless form still rested. Strickland stood nearby, his brow furrowed as he scribbled notes, occasionally glancing at the lifeless figure as if it might suddenly provide answers. Poirot's eyes roamed the room, absorbing every detail with the precision of a watchmaker inspecting a delicate mechanism. The desk was, as Poirot had noted earlier, meticulously arranged. Papers stacked neatly, a brass inkwell polished to a mirror sheen, and the single, blood-stained letter opener still embedded in Bellamy's chest. Poirot leaned closer, his gaze narrowing. There was a curious tidiness to the scene, a deliberate arrangement that felt wrong. His eyes caught the slender volume still lying on the floor. He bent, careful not to disturb its position, and noted the title embossed in gold on the cracked leather spine: Sussex Legends and Folklore. Poirot's fingers hovered just above the cover, his head tilting slightly as if the book whispered some hidden truth. He straightened, his gaze flicking to the ornate grandfather clock that stood against the far wall, its brass pendulum slicing through the silence with a steady, solemn beat. 10:23 a.m. It was a detail Poirot filed away, his mind already weaving threads of possibility. Strickland cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We've taken initial fingerprints, Poirot. The letter opener. Seems it was wiped clean before it was plunged into him. No usable prints. It's a deliberate act, no doubt about it." Poirot's mustache twitched. "Indeed, my friend, a calculated act, I should think. Not a crime of sudden passion, but one planned with care." He moved to the bookshelves, his eyes dancing over the titles. "Tell me, Inspector, have you considered the state of this room, its orderliness, the precision? It is almost as though our Mr. Bellamy anticipated his own demise and sought to leave us a clue." Strickland gave a grunt, folding his notebook closed. You think he knew his killer? Perhaps even let them in willingly. Poirot straightened, his fingers tracing the edge of a particularly well-worn volume. That is one possibility, yes. But consider this. If Bellamy feared for his life, why not flee? Why not cry out or struggle? No, mon ami. I believe there is a deeper game at play here, too. He returned to the desk, his eyes settling once more on Bellamy's lifeless face. The old man's expression was one of mild surprise, his grey eyes wide, lips slightly parted, as if he had been in the midst of forming a question at the moment the blade struck. Poirot's gaze fell upon the open ledger beside Bellamy's elbow, its pages covered in the librarian's precise, slanting script. The ink was fresh, the lines crisp. A recent entry, then. Poirot leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. The words formed a list of book titles, each carefully noted with a date and a brief comment. His finger traced the most recent entry, Sussex Legends and Folklore. Curious references, check binding for notes. Poirot's brow furrowed, and he reached for the fallen book. He flipped it open to the page it had landed on, his eyes quickly scanning the dense text. Halfway down the page, a passage had been underlined in heavy, dark ink. It is said that within these quiet Sussex hills, secrets lie as deeply buried as ancient roots, their tendrils reaching through time, binding the past to the present. Poirot's lips tightened into a thin line. He straightened, closing the book with a soft thud and turning to Strickland. "Inspector, I would advise that this book be kept under the strictest guard. It is, I suspect, the key to our mystery. And if I am not mistaken, it has already cost one man his life." Strickland looked, puzzled, but nodded, signaling to a nearby constable to secure the volume. Poirot cast one final glance at the desk, his mind racing through the implications. A careful murder, a coded message, a book left conspicuously on the floor, each a piece of a puzzle he had only begun to assemble. He moved to the doorway, his eyes catching a faint scuff mark on the polished threshold. He crouched, inspecting it closely. The mark was small, almost imperceptible, a thin, smeared line as if someone had dragged their foot in haste. He straightened, his mind ticking over the possibilities. Poirot's gaze drifted to the hall beyond, where a faint, floral scent lingered. A hint of lavender, perhaps, or rosewater. A scent far too delicate for a man like Bellamy, but perhaps not for the more refined members of the household. He filed this detail away, his thoughts already turning to Abigail's pale, nervous face and Francis's sharp, watchful eyes. He stepped into the hall, pausing as the grandfather clock struck the half-hour, its chime echoing through the stillness of the manor. Poirot's fingers tapped a thoughtful rhythm against his walking stick as he made his way back to the drawing-room where the suspects still waited, their nerves fraying with each passing moment. As he entered, every head turned toward him, eyes wide, breaths held in unspoken anticipation. Poirot took his time, his gaze settling first on Lawrence, then Abigail, then Francis, and finally Sir Hugo, who met his eyes with a look of weary resignation. "My friends," Poirot began, his voice calm but firm, "I have seen the scene of this unfortunate death, and already I have found much to interest the little grey cells. But there remain many questions that each of you, I suspect, hold the answers to. And so, I shall ask you to bear with me a little longer, for it is through patience and observation that we shall unearth the truth." A ripple of unease passed through the room, and Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The game had begun, and already he could sense the first tremors of fear, the subtle shift in posture as each suspect silently wondered what the great detective might uncover next. Poirot settled himself into the high-backed armchair near the fire, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes sharp and unblinking as they swept over the assembled Devereux family. The crackling of the hearth provided a low, steady backdrop, the only sound in the otherwise breathless silence of the drawing-room. Sir Hugo leaned forward, his wrinkled hands gripping the polished arms of his chair, knuckles pale. Lawrence's jaw remained tight, his foot tapping a restless beat against the hardwood floor. Abigail, still perched on the edge of her seat, had her eyes fixed on the carpet, her hands folded so tightly that the tips of her fingers had gone white. Frances, by contrast, sat rigid and composed, her face a cold mask of indifference. Poirot's gaze lingered, briefly on each of them before he spoke. "It is curious, is it not, that a man as meticulous as Mr. Bellamy should meet his end in a room so precisely ordered?" He tapped his fingers together lightly. A librarian, a man of habit, of precision. Such a man leaves little to chance. Strickland, who had taken a seat beside Poirot, gave a low grunt. Perhaps he simply had the misfortune to meet a killer with a similar penchant for neatness. Poirot's moustache twitched. "Ah, but there is neatness, and then there is order born of fear. Consider, mon cher inspector, the ledger on Bellamy's desk, its pages freshly inked. He had discovered something, I think. Something he felt compelled to record, perhaps even to hide. But what, I wonder, could so alarm a man of his temperament?" Lawrence's foot stilled, his eyes flicking to Poirot, a hint of unease breaking through his earlier bravado. Abigail's head dipped lower, a curtain of dark hair concealing her face. Frances, for her part, remained as still as a statue, her hands resting serenely in her lap. Poirot's eyes lingered on her for a moment before he turned his attention back to Sir Hugo. "You mentioned earlier, monsieur, that Bellamy had hinted at a discovery, something he intended to share with you this morning. Can you recall his exact words?" Sir Hugo's brow furrowed, his gaze growing distant as he searched his memory. He said he had found something of great interest, something that might change the way we think about the Devereux legacy. I assumed it was one of his literary oddities, some forgotten manuscript or piece of family history. Poirot's fingers tapped a thoughtful rhythm against his chin. "And you did not press him further?" Sir Hugo's eyes darkened. Bellamy had a flair for the dramatic. I had long since ceased to be surprised by his discoveries. He once claimed to have found a lost Chaucer manuscript, only to realize it was a clever forgery. I thought little of his excitement this time. Poirot leaned back, his gaze drifting to the flickering flames in the hearth. But what if this time it was not mere literary treasure that he had uncovered? What if it was something far more dangerous? Lawrence's eyes narrowed, his foot beginning its restless tapping once more. "What exactly are you implying, Poirot? That Bellamy found something so scandalous it cost him his life?" Poirot's head tilted slightly, his eyes sharpening. "That, my young friend, is precisely what I am suggesting. Consider the ledger entry, the reference to the binding of the book. Why would a librarian, a man who has likely handled thousands of volumes, feel the need to examine the binding of a single obscure text?" A tense silence stretched across the room. Frances's eyes flicked to Sir Hugo, a fleeting look that did not escape Poirot's notice. He let the moment linger, allowing the discomfort to settle before continuing. "I have instructed Inspector Strickland to secure that particular volume, Sussex Legends and Folklore, and to have it examined thoroughly. I suspect it holds the key to this mystery, and I must warn you all." His eyes swept the room, his voice lowering to a grave whisper. "If Bellamy found something worth killing for, it is likely our killer will not stop at one death." The fire crackled loudly, as if echoing Poirot's warning. Abigail's head snapped up, her eyes wide, her lips parting as if to speak, but she caught herself, her mouth snapping shut again. Frances's cool composure remained unbroken, but a faint, ghostly pallor had crept into her cheeks. Sir Hugo's hands trembled, and for a moment it seemed the old man might speak, but he merely lowered his gaze, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Poirot watched them all closely, his little grey cells buzzing with the subtle shifts in posture, the flickers of fear and guilt that passed across each face. He felt the weight of a dozen silent conversations passing between the family members, each one a thread in the intricate web of deceit that had begun to reveal itself. Finally, Poirot rose, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving the Devereux clan. "For now, I shall take my leave, but I will return this evening when I expect to have a clearer understanding of this tragic affair. I suggest, mes amis, that you use the time wisely, for when I return, I shall have questions, and the truth it has a way of revealing itself, no matter how deeply it is buried." Without waiting for a response, Poirot crossed the room, his polished shoes clicking softly against the polished wood as he stepped into the hallway, the grandfather clock chiming the hours he passed. He paused briefly at the library door, casting one final glance at the shadowed interior, the scene of the crime etched indelibly into his memory. As he descended the sweeping staircase to the foyer, Poirot's mind turned over the pieces of the puzzle, each observation, each flicker of emotion, each whispered word. There was something here, something he had not yet seen, a hidden connection that, once revealed, would cast the entire affair into sharp, undeniable focus. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the ivy clinging to the stone walls of the manor, whispering secrets of its own. Poirot tightened his grip on his walking stick, his step firm and deliberate as he crossed the gravel drive to his waiting car. The game was afoot, and Hercule Poirot had never felt more alive. Poirot returned to his rooms at the modest inn in the nearby village, a place whose creaking floors and faint scent of lavender soap struck a sharp contrast to the grandeur of the Devereux estate. He set his walking stick against the umbrella stand by the door and removed his hat with a deliberate, thoughtful motion. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace-curtained windows, casting delicate patterns across the polished floorboards, but Poirot's mind remained fixed on darker matters. He seated himself at the small writing desk, pulling a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer and uncapping his fountain pen with a soft, satisfying click. His thoughts returned to the ledger, the odd entry regarding the book's binding, and the nervous glances exchanged among the Devereux family. There were secrets here, layers of hidden truths that required careful peeling, and he intended to strip them bare. He began writing, his script neat and controlled. Observations, the Devereux family, and the death of Mr. Bellamy. Bellamy's fear. Why examine the binding of an obscure text? Fear or anticipation of discovery? The family's reaction. Tension among the Devereux, particularly between Lawrence and Abigail. What are they hiding? Francis Devereux. The only one to maintain a facade of complete calm? A mask or genuine indifference? He paused, tapping the pen thoughtfully against his chin. The image of Francis's cold, unblinking stare flitted across his mind, the way she had barely reacted to his pointed questions, her face an inscrutable mask of aristocratic composure. She was, he suspected, the key to understanding this tangled affair. Poirot set down his pen, his eyes narrowing as he considered the implications. Francis had been the only one not visibly shaken by his mention of a second death. Could it be that she, alone among the family, knew precisely what Bellamy had discovered and why it had cost him his life? He rose abruptly, retrieving his hat and stick once more. There were questions that needed answering, and time, as ever, was of the essence. Poirot made his way downstairs, nodding politely to the innkeeper's wife as he passed through the front hall, her plump face breaking into a warm, if slightly puzzled smile as he tipped his hat in her direction. The walk to the Devereux estate was brisk, the air sharp with the tang of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke. As he approached the grand stone manor, its grey walls rising like the bones of some ancient, slumbering beast, Poirot felt the familiar stir of anticipation. Here, within these walls, lay the answers he sought, if only he could see them clearly. The butler, a thin, solemn man with the air of one accustomed to tragedy, admitted him without a word, leading him back to the drawing-room where the family had gathered once more. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears and whispered suspicions. Sir Hugo looked up as Poirot entered, his face a ghastly shade of grey, as if the years had weighed down upon him in a matter of hours. Lawrence stood by the window, one hand pressed against the glass, his reflection a ghostly double in the pale afternoon light. Abigail sat curled in an armchair, her hands still knotted together, eyes darting nervously as Poirot took his place by the hearth. Frances remained perfectly composed, her gaze fixed on Poirot with an intensity that might have unnerved a lesser man. Poirot inclined his head, his voice smooth but firm. "I trust, mes amis, that you have had time to reflect upon our earlier conversation. I have returned as promised, and I must now press you further. I require truth, not evasion, for without it we shall find ourselves mired in the darkness of uncertainty." Lawrence turned sharply from the window, his face set in a grim mask. "If you have something to say, Poirot, say it. I, for one, am tired of your insinuations." Poirot's mustache twitched with faint amusement. "Insinuations, Monsieur Lawrence? No. I deal only in facts, and the facts, they are beginning to reveal themselves." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Tell me, monsieur, were you aware that Mr. Bellamy had been investigating the history of this family?" Lawrence's eyes flicked to his father, then to his sister, before settling once more on Poirot. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "Bellamy's interests were his own. He never discussed his work with me." "Indeed?" Poirot took a small, measured step closer, his eyes fixed on Lawrence's face. "And yet you have been acting as if you had much to fear. You were quick to deny any recent contact with Bellamy, despite your sister's admission that she visited the library this morning. Is it not curious that you, the elder son, should avoid the very room where your uncle met his end?" Lawrence's fists tightened at his sides, his face flushing with sudden anger. "Are you accusing me, Poirot? Is that what this is?" Poirot's head tilted slightly, his expression one of mild surprise. "Accusing? No, monsieur, I merely observe. But your reaction? It is most telling." He allowed the moment to linger, then turned to Frances. "And you, madame, have you nothing to say? You have been most silent, most composed through all of this. I wonder, are you truly without fear, or have you simply grown accustomed to keeping secrets?" Frances's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Secrets, Monsieur Poirot. I am a woman of society. Secrets are the very breath of our existence." Poirot's eyes sharpened, his mind seizing upon her words like a cat upon a mouse. "Ah, but there are secrets, madame, and then there are lies. And it is the latter that concern me now." Frances's smile remained fixed, but a flicker of something, unease perhaps, or even fear, passed behind her eyes. Poirot noted it with quiet satisfaction, his mind already racing ahead to the next piece of the puzzle. He straightened, his gaze sweeping the room one final time. "I shall take my leave for now, but rest assured, mes amis, I'm far from finished. There is much yet to uncover, and the truth, it draws ever closer." With a final nod, Poirot turned and made his way to the door, his mind alight with possibilities. He had seen the first crack in the Devereux family's carefully constructed facade, and he intended to widen it until the whole sordid truth came tumbling out. Poirot's steps echoed softly along the polished corridors of the Devereux manor, the sound swallowed by the thick velvet drapes and heavy tapestries lining the walls. He paused as he reached the grand staircase, his eyes drifting to the portrait gallery that stretched along the upper landing. Generations of Devereux stared back at him, their painted eyes solemn, their expressions varying shades of pride, defiance, and quiet menace. He turned sharply, his feet carrying him back toward the library, drawn by the lingering aura of violence and betrayal that still clung to the room. The door creaked softly as he entered, and the familiar scents of old parchment, leather, and drying blood met his senses once more. The police had taken Bellamy's body away, leaving behind only the faint, rusty stain on the thick carpet where he had fallen. Poirot's eyes moved to the desk, its surface still bearing the imprint of a life ended abruptly. The ledger had been removed, the papers stacked neatly as if Bellamy himself had ordered them mere moments before his death. Poirot moved to the window, pushing aside the heavy velvet curtain to peer out at the fog-shrouded garden beyond. The grey light filtered through the ancient glass, casting pale, warped shadows across the floor. He let the curtain fall back into place, his mind turning over the fragments of conversation from earlier. Francis's words echoed in his mind. Secrets are the very breath of our existence. A curious admission, one that bespoke a long history of concealment and deceit. And Lawrence, so quick to anger, so determined to deny any connection to Bellamy's research. Poirot's fingers tapped a quiet rhythm against his walking stick. The family was hiding something, and he suspected it ran deeper than mere sibling rivalry or financial ambition. He crossed to the bookshelf, his fingers skimming over the leather spines until he found the gap where Sussex legends and folklore had once rested. He leaned in closer, his sharp eyes noting the faint outline of dust where the book had sat undisturbed for years before Bellamy's sudden interest. He straightened, his mind turning over the implications. The book had been hidden in plain sight, its significance masked by the very clutter that surrounded it. Why had Bellamy, a man known for his obsessive attention to detail, suddenly taken such interest in a forgotten volume of local law? What had he discovered within its pages that had sealed his fate? Poirot's musings were interrupted by the soft creak of the library door behind him. He turned, his eyes narrowing as Lawrence stepped into the room, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the door behind him. Poirot offered a small, polite nod, his expression carefully neutral. "Monsieur Lawrence, what a pleasant surprise. I did not expect to find you here." Lawrence hesitated, his eyes darting to the dark stain on the carpet before quickly looking away. I wanted to speak with you, Poirot, away from the others." Poirot's eyebrows lifted, a hint of intrigue sparking in his eyes. "Indeed. And what, may I ask, weighs so heavily upon your mind?" Lawrence moved to the window, his silhouette framed against the grey light beyond. He drew a deep, shuddering breath, his shoulders tensing as if bracing for a physical blow. "I don't trust Francis," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "She's hiding something. I've known her my whole life, and I can tell when she's lying." Poirot took a measured step closer, his gaze never leaving Lawrence's face. "And what do you believe she is hiding, monsieur? You must understand that vague suspicions are of little use to me. I require facts, observations." Lawrence's hands tightened into fists, his knuckles stark white against the dark fabric of his jacket. I can't say for certain, but I know she was close to Bellamy, closer than she ever let on. She visited him often, always alone, always after dark. She claimed it was to discuss family history, but I've seen the way she looks at his empty chair, the way her hands tremble when his name is mentioned. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind racing through the implications. Frances, the Ice Queen of the Devereux family, had a connection to the late librarian, a connection she had taken great pains to conceal. But what was the nature of this bond, and how might it relate to Bellamy's untimely death? He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, confidential tone. "And you, monsieur, what of your own connection to Mr. Bellamy? You claim to have had little contact, yet your reactions tell a different story. I have seen the tension in your jaw, the quickness of your temper. You fear something, perhaps more than you are willing to admit." Lawrence's eyes flicked to the dark stain on the carpet, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. For a moment, it seemed as if he might break, his composure crumbling under the weight of Poirot's steady gaze. But then he straightened, his jaw tightening, his eyes hardening to a cold, defiant glare. "I have nothing to hide, Poirot," he said, his voice steady once more. My sister is the one with secrets, not I." Poirot inclined his head, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. "As you say, monsieur. But remember, the truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how deeply it is buried." Lawrence turned sharply, his footsteps echoing against the polished floor as he strode from the room, the door closing with a soft, final click behind him. Poirot remained where he stood, his eyes drifting back to the empty space on the bookshelf, his mind already moving ahead to the next piece of the puzzle. The Devereux family's secrets were beginning to unravel, thread by delicate thread, and he had every intention of pulling them apart until the whole sordid tapestry lay bare before him. Poirot lingered in the shadowed confines of the library, his keen eyes tracing the path Lawrence had taken as the young man stormed from the room. He remained motionless for a long moment, his mind sorting through the fresh revelations Lawrence had just unwittingly offered. Frances had been close to Bellamy, closer than anyone had suspected. Yet she had chosen to remain silent, her icy composure concealing whatever emotions stirred beneath the surface. The house itself seemed to breathe around him, the ancient wood creaking softly, the heavy tapestries absorbing every whisper, every secret. Poirot moved to the window once more, his fingers brushing the cold glass as he stared out at the darkening garden, its twisted hedgerows and leaf-strewn paths now shrouded in early evening mist. He let his mind drift back to Frances's words. Secrets are the very breath of our existence. She had spoken them with a confidence that now seemed almost taunting, as if daring him to pry into the hidden recesses of her life. He turned away from the window, his gaze settling on the fireplace, its empty grate cold and dark. On the mantelpiece stood a collection of small framed photographs, their silver edges catching the last traces of daylight. Poirot approached them, his steps light and precise, his head tilting as he examined each image in turn. There were portraits of Sir Hugo as a young man, his jaw firm, his eyes fierce with the confidence of youth. A somber image of Lawrence and Abigail as children, their faces solemn, their clothes stiff and formal, stood beside a more recent photograph of Frances, her eyes shadowed, her mouth set in a thin, inscrutable line. Poirot's fingers brushed the edge of the frame, his mind turning over the implications of her silent, calculating demeanor. What had bound her to Bellamy, and why had she hidden it so carefully? He glanced back at the empty space on the bookshelf, his thoughts narrowing to a single, sharp point. Whatever secrets Bellamy had uncovered, Frances had known of them, perhaps even before the unfortunate librarian had met his end. The soft rustle of skirts behind him broke his concentration. Poirot straightened, turning slowly to find Abigail standing in the doorway, her dark eyes wide, her face pale against the deep green velvet of her dress. She hesitated, one gloved hand gripping the door frame as if for support, her chest rising and falling with shallow, rapid breaths. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, her voice trembling, I must speak with you, alone." Poirot's eyes sharpened, a flicker of interest passing through them. He gestured to a nearby chair, his manner as polite as ever. "Of course, mademoiselle. Please sit. Take a moment to compose yourself." Abigail crossed the room slowly, her steps unsteady, her gaze darting nervously to the shadows that clung to the corners of the library. She sank into the chair, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the carpet as if seeking some measure of comfort in its intricate pattern. Poirot seated himself opposite her, his gaze unwavering as he studied her trembling frame, the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the way her fingers twisted together with almost frantic energy. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, leaning forward slightly, "you are afraid, are you not? You fear that the truth will come to light, that the secrets you have kept so carefully will be exposed." Abigail's head jerked up, her eyes widening in sudden alarm. "No, I only want the truth to be known. I never wanted this, any of it. I never thought it would go so far." Poirot's mustache twitched, his interest piqued. go so far. What is it, mademoiselle, that you fear has gone beyond your control? Abigail's hands tightened, her knuckles standing out starkly against the dark fabric of her gloves. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes flicking once more to the dark stain on the carpet before quickly looking away. I heard them, Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Late at night, when the house was quiet, when the shadows grew long and the walls seemed to whisper their secrets. I heard them in this very room, Bellamy and Francis, their voices low, urgent, full of fear. They spoke of something hidden, something that could destroy us all." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he caught the faint, bitter note of desperation in her voice. "And what did they speak of, mademoiselle? What was it that they feared so greatly?" Abigail's eyes filled with sudden tears, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I only know that Francis became colder, more distant, as if something had changed between them, as if she no longer trusted him. And then, one night, I heard Bellamy plead with her, begging her to do something, to act before it was too late." Poirot's fingers tightened on the arms of his chair, his mind racing through the implications of her words. Francis and Bellamy had shared a secret, a dangerous knowledge that had driven a wedge between them, perhaps even leading to the librarian's untimely death. He reached out, his hand settling gently on Abigail's trembling arm. "Mademoiselle, I must ask you to be brave. If there is something you know, something you have not yet shared, you must tell me now. Lives may depend upon it." Abigail's eyes filled with fresh tears, her shoulders shaking with the effort to contain her fear. She glanced toward the door, her breath catching as the sound of distant footsteps echoed from the hallway beyond. I cannot," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I cannot betray my family." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind seizing upon the single, whispered confession as if it were a lifeline in a storm-tossed sea. He released her arm, leaning back into his chair as he considered her words. "No, mademoiselle," he said softly, his voice as sharp as a blade, "but you have already betrayed yourself." As Abigail rose from her chair, her steps unsteady, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, Poirot remained seated, his mind racing through the implications of her fearful admission. She had heard too much, seen too much, and now the weight of her knowledge threatened to crush her. As the door closed softly behind her, Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, the threads of deceit slowly unraveling as he closed in on the truth. Whatever dark secret Francis had shared with Bellamy, it had driven the librarian to desperation, and perhaps to his grave. Poirot remained seated in the shadowed library, the flickering gaslight casting long, wavering shadows across the polished wood paneling. The house had grown quieter in Abigail's wake, the faint murmurs of the household staff and the creak of ancient beams settling into the stillness of early evening. He let his mind drift back over her whispered confession, the fear in her eyes, the tremor in her voice as she had spoken of Francis and Bellamy's secret meetings. She had revealed more than she perhaps realized, and Poirot, ever alert to the nuances of human behavior, had noted each trembling word, each anxious glance. He rose slowly, his shoes making barely a whisper against the thick carpet as he crossed to the window. The mist had thickened, rolling in from the moors to wrap the garden in a damp, spectral shroud. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows and twisted yews, the distant call of a hunting horn drifted through the fog, its mournful echo swallowed by the enveloping grey. Poirot turned from the window, his eyes settling once more on the empty space where Sussex legends and folklore had once rested. Bellamy had plucked that volume from the shelf, and it had cost him his life. What had he discovered within its pages that had driven him to confront Francis in the dead of night? What secret lay hidden among the faded ink and brittle paper, a truth so dangerous that it had shattered the careful equilibrium of the Devereux family? Poirot's fingers traced the edge of the bookshelf, his mind sifting through the fragments of the case. Bellamy's fear, Francis's cold detachment, Lawrence's simmering rage, Abigail's whispered warnings, all pointed to a hidden truth, a long-buried scandal that threatened to destroy the family's carefully constructed facade. He turned abruptly, his gaze sweeping the library one final time before he moved toward the door. He had lingered in the shadows long enough, allowing the pieces to settle into place. Now it was time to act, to press the Devereaux for the truth they had so carefully concealed. Poirot's steps echoed softly as he moved through the darkened corridors of the manor, his sharp eyes noting every flickering shadow, every whispered breath of cold air that crept from beneath the closed doors. He reached the grand staircase, his hand settling lightly on the polished banister as he descended into the marble-floored foyer, its sweeping arches and gleaming statues casting long, ghostly reflections in the candlelight. As he reached the base of the stairs, a soft rustle of fabric caught his attention. He turned, his sharp eyes catching the faint, retreating form of Frances as she slipped through a side door into the rear wing of the house. Her steps were quick, her head bowed, her posture stiff with barely concealed tension. Poirot's mustache twitched with quiet satisfaction. He had seen the crack in her icy composure, the flicker of fear in her eyes as he had confronted her earlier. Now, it seemed, she had reached the breaking point. He followed her, his steps light, his breath steady, his senses alert to every creak of the ancient floorboards, every rustling shadow that clung to the narrow, winding corridor. The air grew colder as he moved deeper into the house, the damp stone walls pressing close, the flickering sconces casting sharp, jagged patterns across his path. At the far end of the hallway, Frances slipped through a narrow, iron-bound door, her figure briefly framed in the faint, flickering glow of a distant lantern before she vanished into the darkness beyond. Poirot hesitated, his sharp mind weighing the risks of confrontation, the danger of revealing his hand too soon. But then, with a small, decisive nod, he followed her, his footsteps silent against the cold stone floor. He found himself in a narrow, spiraling staircase, the air growing colder, damper as he descended into the bowels of the ancient manor. The walls here were rough, the stones uneven, their surfaces glistening with a thin sheen of moisture that clung to his fingertips as he brushed them in passing. At the base of the stairs, a long, low passage stretched into darkness, the air thick with the earthy scent of damp stone and decaying mortar. A faint, distant light flickered at the far end, casting faint, trembling shadows against the rough walls. Poirot moved slowly, his senses alert, his mind racing through the possibilities. What lay at the end of this narrow, forgotten passage? What secret had Frances sought to conceal in this hidden corner of the manor, this place of damp stone and whispered fears? As he reached the end of the passage, the faint glow resolved into the flicker of a single, guttering lantern, its weak light barely illuminating the small, cluttered room beyond. Shelves lined the walls, their surfaces crowded with crumbling ledgers, rusted keys, and brittle, yellowed papers that crumbled beneath his touch. Frances stood in the center of the room, her back to him, her shoulders stiff, her head bowed as she rifled through a stack of brittle papers, her hands trembling, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Poirot stepped forward, his voice low, his tone firm. "Mademoiselle Devereux, it seems you have wandered far from the light. I wonder, what is it that you seek here, in this place of shadows and forgotten whispers?" Frances froze, her shoulders stiffening, her fingers tightening around the crumbling edge of a parchment. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft drip of water from the ancient stone walls, the faint rustle of paper as it crumbled beneath her grip. She turned slowly, her eyes wide, her face pale in the weak, flickering light. For the first time, Poirot saw true fear in her gaze, a raw, unguarded terror that cut through her practiced composure like a knife. "You should not have come here, Poirot," she whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes darting to the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. "You do not understand. You cannot possibly understand." Poirot took a single, measured step closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "Ah, but I do, mademoiselle. I understand that you are afraid, that you have carried this secret for far too long, that it has poisoned your heart and shattered your peace. But now, the time for secrets has passed. You will tell me the truth, and you will tell it now." Frances's breath caught, her eyes filling with sudden, panicked tears. She staggered back, her hand clutching the crumbling parchment, her fingers white against the brittle, yellowed edge. "You know nothing, Poirot," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Nothing." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind seizing upon her words, his sharp mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle, the whispers of betrayal and fear that clung to the shadows of the ancient house. He had cornered her, driven her to the edge, and now, at last, the truth would come spilling forth, dragged from the darkness into the harsh, unforgiving light of his relentless gaze. Poirot held Frances's gaze, the flickering lantern casting sharp shadows across her pale face, her eyes wide, her lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. The air in the cramped, stone-walled room seemed to grow colder, the dampness clinging to his clothes, seeping into his bones as he took another measured step forward. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, his voice low but firm, "the time for shadows has passed. You have carried this secret for too long. Let it twist your heart, poison your mind. Whatever darkness haunts you, whatever truth you have sought to bury here among these crumbling walls, it is time to let it go." Frances's breath came in short, shallow gasps, her eyes darting from Poirot to the shelves that lined the small room, their surfaces crowded with forgotten ledgers, rusting keys, and stacks of brittle, yellowed paper. Her fingers tightened around the parchment in her hand, the dry, crumbling edges flaking beneath her grip. I cannot," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, her eyes filled with a wild, desperate light. "You do not understand, Poirot. This family, this house, it is built on secrets, on lies. If the truth comes out, it will destroy us all." Poirot's mustache twitched, a flicker of satisfaction sparking in his eyes. He took another step closer, his gaze never leaving her pale, stricken face. "Ah, but mademoiselle, it is not the truth that destroys. It is the lies, the half-truths, the whispered fears that twist the heart and poison the mind. You must tell me, Frances, for your own sake, if not for that of your family." Frances's breath caught, her shoulders stiffening as his words struck home, the brittle parchment crumbling between her fingers as she clutched it to her chest, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. I cannot," she whispered again, her voice breaking, her eyes filling with sudden, panicked tears. "I am trapped, Poirot, trapped by my own choices, by the promises I have made, by the secrets I have kept." Poirot's gaze sharpened, his mind seizing upon her words, the faint, desperate note of self-recrimination that echoed through her trembling whisper. He stepped closer still, his shadow falling over her as he leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, confidential murmur. "Frances," he said softly, his eyes locked on hers, "you speak of promises, of secrets. But to whom have you made these promises? To Bellamy, perhaps? The man you met in this very room, the man who pleaded with you to act before it was too late." Frances's eyes widened, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, her hands trembling as she clutched the crumbling parchment to her chest. For a long moment she seemed on the verge of breaking, her composure crumbling beneath the weight of Poirot's relentless gaze. But then, with a sudden, violent motion, she straightened, her jaw tightening, her eyes hardening to a cold, steely glare. "No," she whispered, her voice sharp, defiant. "I owe you nothing, Poirot. You think you understand, but you do not. You cannot possibly comprehend the darkness that runs through this family, the shadows that cling to these walls. Leave me be. Leave this place before it destroys you, as it has destroyed so many before you." Poirot took a slow, measured breath, his mind racing through the implications of her words, the thinly veiled threat that hung in the air between them. He stepped back, his eyes never leaving her pale, stricken face, his mind already moving ahead to the final critical steps of his investigation. "As you wish, mademoiselle," he said softly, his voice calm, even gentle, despite the icy rage that flickered in her eyes. "But know this. I will uncover the truth, no matter how deeply you have sought to bury it, no matter how dark the shadows you have wrapped around it. I will find it, and when I do, I will bring it into the light, where no shadow can hide it." Frances's breath caught, her eyes filling with sudden, wild fear, her hands trembling as she clutched the crumbling parchment to her chest. Poirot watched her for a long moment, his sharp eyes noting every flicker of fear, every tremor of guilt, before he turned sharply, his shoes whispering against the cold stone floor as he strode from the room, his footsteps echoing down the narrow, twisting corridor. As he reached the base of the spiral staircase, his mind still turning over the fragments of Frances's whispered confession, a sudden, sharp sound echoed from the passage behind him, a brittle, splintering crack like the breaking of old, dry wood, followed by the soft, wet thud of something heavy hitting the stone floor. Poirot froze, his breath catching, his heart racing as the sound echoed through the darkness. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he peered back into the gloom, the faint, flickering glow of the lantern casting long, jagged shadows across the damp, crumbling walls. For a long, breathless moment, the silence stretched, the only sound the soft, steady drip of water from the ancient stone above. And then, slowly, hesitantly, the faint, trembling sound of a woman sobbing reached his ears, the thin, broken wail of a soul pushed to the edge, teetering on the brink of despair. Poirot hesitated, his mind racing, his senses alert to every flickering shadow, every whispered breath of cold air that crept through the dark, narrow passage. And then, with a small, decisive nod, he turned and strode back toward the flickering lantern, his sharp eyes narrowing as he caught sight of the crumpled form of Frances, her pale, stricken face turned upward, her wide, terrified eyes locked on the crumbling stone above as she whispered a single, trembling word. "Forgive me." Poirot's steps slowed, his heart pounding, his mind racing through the implications of her broken whisper, the trembling, desperate confession that clung to the damp air like the echo of a long-forgotten sin. He had driven her to this moment, forced her to confront the darkness she had sought so desperately to conceal. And now, at last, the truth would come spilling forth, dragged from the shadows into the harsh, unforgiving light of his relentless gaze. Poirot's gaze lingered on Frances as she sank to her knees, the weight of whatever burden she carried breaking through the last of her resolve. Her pale hands trembled as she clutched the remains of the parchment, now dampened by her tears and the cold air of the hidden archive. He said nothing at first, only observing, letting the silence press upon her like a vice. His instincts told him she was on the verge of revealing everything, but as with all delicate moments, it must be handled with care, not force. Gently, he approached. "Mademoiselle Frances," he said softly, almost tenderly, "you must understand. I do not come to ruin reputations or tear down families. But when a man lies dead, and the truth lies buried beside him, it must be unearthed, not for vengeance, but for justice." Frances's breath caught, her voice emerging hoarse and broken. Bellamy. He found something in the family. Papers. I think he believed it gave him power. Over me, over Aunt Eugenia. And in a way, he was right." Poirot kneeled beside her, his handkerchief already produced and offered. She took it with a shaky nod. "What did he find, mademoiselle?" "A letter," she whispered. "From my grandfather to his solicitor." It contained instructions, not about the estate, but about money. Money siphoned off from the trust to a woman, a mistress. Her name was Eloise Bartram. Aunt Eugenia had always idolized our grandfather, spoke of him as if he were above reproach. But Bellamy saw the letter. He wanted to expose the scandal, unless we gave him what he wanted. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And what was that exactly? Francis hesitated. The deanship of the Armitage Foundation. He wanted the chair of trustees, a role with access to the legacy fund. The board wouldn't approve him, but if the Chattertons, our family, supported his appointment, it would sway the vote. He used the letter as leverage. Poirot stood slowly, the picture becoming clearer with every revelation. Blackmail, pride, and the preservation of an old family name. It was a poisonous mix, one that fermented easily into murder. But still, something did not align. Mademoiselle, I must ask, was he killed because of this letter? Frances shook her head slowly. No, I think someone else took the matter into their own hands. Aunt Eugenia knew about the letter. I showed it to her weeks ago after Bellamy began to threaten me openly. She burned it in the fireplace herself. She said the family name had survived far worse. And yet, Poirot said quietly, Bellamy was silenced, not for lack of proof then, for something else. A shiver ran through Francis. That morning, before we discovered his body, I overheard Aunt Eugenia speaking to Mr. Dunning. She was angry. She said he had made things worse, that his interference had drawn attention. Poirot's expression remained unreadable, but inside his thoughts swirled rapidly. Dunning, the archivist who had inserted himself into nearly every facet of the case, modest, meticulous, and, until now, seemingly irrelevant. But what if irrelevance was his disguise? Francis's voice had taken on a steadier tone now, her confession having lifted a weight. Do you think it was Mr. Dunning? Poirot gave a gentle smile. Let us say, mademoiselle, that I have my suspicions, but I do not accuse until the facts have taken their rightful shape. He glanced at the crumbling walls. Come, this is no place for a young woman to linger. Together they emerged into the soft amber light of late afternoon, the shadows long in the quiet corridors of the manor. Poirot left Francis in the care of Miss Halberd, who, though flinty in demeanor, softened at the sight of the girl's pallor and red-rimmed eyes. Poirot, meanwhile, requested one final gathering. Within the drawing-room, the suspects assembled as though summoned to a reading of a will. Eugenia Chatterton sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, her face expressionless save for a faint twitch near her right eye. Miss Halberd stood with folded arms beside the fireplace, while Maxwell Linton slouched in a corner, his gaze sliding uneasily toward the window. Dunning entered last, his spectacles glinting, expression calm but guarded. Poirot stood before them all, immaculate and composed, his hands folded gently over his stomach. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, you have been most patient with me, and now I repay your kindness with the truth. A ripple passed through the room. Eugenia's eyes narrowed. You see, the death of Mr. Bellamy was not a spontaneous act, nor was it, as some may suspect, a moment of passion. It was calculated, cold, quiet, the work of someone who knew how to exploit silence and proximity. Maxwell Linton shifted in his seat. Let us first consider the tea, so often overlooked. Bellamy had a very specific blend, yes? One that was brought to him directly by Miss Halberd. And yet, he held up a hand. Miss Halberd did not touch the tea that day, nor did she see it prepared. Miss Halberd stiffened. No, I left it on the cart. Precisely. And it was Mr. Dunning who brought it to the library. A generous gesture, yes? Poirot turned his gaze on the archivist. You claimed to be checking the cataloguing slips, but in truth you stayed in the corridor longer than necessary. Just long enough to make a small alteration. Dunning opened his mouth, then closed it again. Poirot stepped forward. The poison, my friends, was not in the teapot. It was in the sugar, a single lump prepared in advance. Bellamy took 2 and only 1 was laced. Eugenia gave a small, sharp gasp. Poirot continued. The sugar bowl was replaced afterward, refilled from a clean box, and Dunning, who handles every piece of paper and parcel in this house with gloves and ceremony, left no trace. He let the silence settle. But why, you ask? Why should a humble archivist kill a man of Bellamy's station? Poirot's voice dropped to a hush. Because Bellamy knew his secret. Dunning, whose real name is Roland Densmore, was once an associate of Eloise Bartram. Not as a lover. No, as her solicitor's clerk. He helped launder money through an account tied to the Chatterton Trust. A mistake made in youth, perhaps, but one Bellamy recognized when they crossed paths in Oxford years ago. Dunning's face had turned pale. When Bellamy uncovered the old letter, he found not just scandal, but familiarity. He approached Dunning, threatened exposure. And Dunning, already settled here, enjoying the quiet power of forgotten archives, could not risk being unmasked. Poirot paused. So he arranged for a quiet death. A solitary man, a secluded wing, a trusted servant. It was almost perfect. Almost. Dunning stood now, shaking. You have no proof. Poirot's gaze sharpened. None, monsieur, but you made a mistake. In your eagerness to dispose of the poisoned sugar lump, you placed the remnants, slightly discolored, at the bottom of the dumbwaiter shaft, a place you assumed no one would inspect. But I did. A hush fell across the room like snowfall. Dunning faltered, then bolted. Miss Halberd, surprisingly swift for her age, blocked the door. By the time the authorities arrived, Dunning, Roland Densmore, had confessed, quietly, almost with relief. Later, as Poirot and Frances stood on the back lawn, the moonlight spilling over the hedges like silver lace, she turned to him. You were right, she said softly. Lies destroy more than truth ever could. Poirot smiled, eyes gentle. Oui, mademoiselle. But the truth, when it comes, must be faced with courage, and you have that in abundance. She looked away, blinking back something unspoken. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, satisfied. It is the nature of secrets, he said, to fester in silence. But even the deepest shadows retreat when the light is applied with precision. He turned then, walking toward the gates of Chatterton Hall, leaving behind silence, not of secrets, but of peace.